Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to APUSH. Today we're going to continue our discussion of America's growing place in the world by introducing Theodore Roosevelt and talking about how he, not single-handedly, but not single-handedly, reshaped American foreign policy and really significantly expanded our role in both the Western Hemisphere and the world. So let's talk about this story. Here's the objectives for today. Let's dive in, talk a little bit about TR and how he expanded the Monroe Doctrine and grew the United States' role in the world. So, obviously, this is not the first time the United States has expanded their role in the world. In the aftermath of the Spanish American War, of course, we had new colonies like the Philippines, like Guam, like Puerto Rico. We had significant control over Cuba through the whole Platt Amendment, stuff like that. And so the United States had already been growing its influence in the world. During this time period, the Qing dynasty had been carved up by European powers, creating these spheres of influence. And so the United States was somewhat concerned because, as you notice on this map here, the United States has no sphere of influence in China. And although we have recoaling ports, and we have a colony in the Philippines, which we're currently, fighting a brutal war in, we don't have any place to open up and to trade with China. So the United States is going to push what's called the open door policy. So here's the open door policy. Take a moment, read, and let's move forward. Basically, the United States wanted to open up all of the treaty ports and allow all Europeans access to all areas of China more or less equally in an attempt to, again, sort of open up trade with Asia and to allow the United States in and cut back on European competition. Most European countries were somewhat amenable to this. I mean, although they were somewhat proprietary over their territories in China, it made sense to sort of expand European merchants' abilities to trade with the failing Qing dynasty. And of course, this provoked the anti Western response of the Boxer Rebellion. The Yezhetian movement pushed back against foreigners and was used to some extent by the Dowager Empress Shiji to attempt to reestablish her control over the tottering Qing dynasty at this point. As you hopefully learned in world history, the Boxer Rebellion was put down by a multinational force, predominantly Japanese, but American troops played a part. And so we moved in and got involved in this whole Boxer Rebellion. And so here we see William McKinley going in to stop, racist depictions of Chinese people from slaughtering Americans and defending our treaty rights. All of this is happening at about the same time McKinley is running for re-election. And as we talked about last time, he had the noted Jingo, former police commissioner, former Secretary of the Navy, hero of San Juan Hill, and former governor of New York, Theodore Roosevelt, on his vice presidential ticket. This was partially in order to shore up McKinley's support with the Jingo wing of the Republican Party, but also partially because Theodore Roosevelt was kind of a pest. He was a reformer. He was an ideologue. He didn't really fit into the Republican Party structure particularly well. And so the vice presidency was a place to put him where he couldn't cause too much trouble. Of course, McKinley's patron, Mark Hanna, was super concerned because, this puts Theodore Roosevelt very close to the reins of power, but it's super unlikely that anyone's going to assassinate the president again. And so, yeah. Hopefully Theodore Roosevelt will stay as vice president and then basically ride off into the sunset and not bother the Republican establishment. Except, of course, McKinley immediately gets assassinated. Well, at the World's Fair in Buffalo, McKinley is approached by an anarchist, Leon Czolgosz, who had, after listening to anarchist propaganda, believed that all world leaders should be killed. You hopefully remember this was happening around the world at this point. Alexander III had been assassinated by anarchist terrorists. And so McKinley gets shot in the stomach and he dies. And Theodore Roosevelt then ascends to the presidency, a position that he almost certainly could never have gotten elected to or nominated to with enough Republican support. And so that's going to give us President Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt becomes the youngest man to ever ascend to the presidency in his early 40s. He's a young and relatively vigorous guy. Theodore Roosevelt has always been a passionate individual, believing in vigorous activity. Specifically, as a kid, he suffered from asthma, and so he would go out on long hikes in order to help build up his physical stamina and his lung capacity. He also at one point took a break from after he was police commissioner of New York after losing a primary for a different political office. He went out west to be a cowboy for a while. He desperately wanted to serve in the military, and his Spanish-American War service was one of the prides of his life. And so now Theodore Roosevelt is going to become president of the United States, and he's going to have vast enforcement power and vast power over foreign policy, which is going to lead to a huge shift sort of in the way that the United States deals with the rest of the world. The first issue that Theodore Roosevelt is going to have to deal with is Japan. Japan is, of course, a rising power, having played a huge role in both the First Sino-Japanese War, the Boxer Rebellion, and then eventually in the aftermath of the Russo-Japanese War. Japan is now a rising power, and Theodore Roosevelt is going to insert himself in there, helping to negotiate peace between the Tsar and the Emperor of China. When both sides are bogged down in Manchuria, he's able to negotiate a peace that doesn't satisfy either side, but does win him the Nobel Peace Prize. And so already at the beginning of his term, what we're seeing from Theodore is a willingness to insert himself into world affairs in a way that we've never really seen an American president do before. In addition to this, he's able to negotiate a solution to the problem of racism against Japanese people on the West Coast. There was a movement to ban Japanese people from public education and to expel Japanese people from the country. You got to remember, this is in the era of the Chinese Exclusion Act and some pretty significant anti-Asian racism. And so Theodore is able to negotiate what's called the Gentleman's Agreement with Japan, by which the United States promises to not discriminate specifically against Japanese if the Japanese government starts putting pressure on its citizens to not emigrate to the United States. This was seen as a win-win for both sides because the Japanese wanted to be treated as equals in Western countries, and they really wanted their citizens to go into civil service and to be part of their growing empire in Asia and not immigrate to the United States. So win-win here. We're going to be less racist against Japanese if fewer Japanese people come here, which, doesn't sound great, but it's sort of worked. At the same time, Theodore Roosevelt is going to enforce the Monroe Doctrine much more vigorously than any president has before. We hopefully remember that we did see some enforcement of the Monroe Doctrine under the Cleveland administration with the Venezuelan crisis. But now we're going to see Theodore repeatedly reminding European countries that, yes, I get it, you have debts in Latin American countries, and yes, you'd like to go in and take over those countries and force them to pay their debts, but the Monroe Doctrine says that you need to stay out, and that is our purview. And so, for example, when England attempts to force the Dominican Republic to pay some of their debts, Theodore Roosevelt reminds them, rather forcibly, of the Monroe Doctrine, the same way Grover Cleveland did. And so we're going to see Theodore Roosevelt again reminding European countries that no interference in the Western Hemisphere is okay. But then Theodore is going to turn around and send in the Marines in order to force the Dominican Republic to pay their debts to England. So it's kind of you're not going to interfere with the countries in Latin America, but now we're going to interfere with the countries in Latin America in order to make sure that you don't need to. So win-win, maybe? This policy is most clearly articulated in Teddy Roosevelt's fourth annual message, which lays out the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which I'll let you read here, but it's pretty straightforward. And I'm just going to quote a little bit of it that you absolutely need to know. Quote, "In the Western Hemisphere, the adherents of the United States to the Monroe Doctrine may force the United States, however reluctantly, in flagrant cases of such wrongdoing or impotence, to the exercise of an international police power." So, this is going to lead the United States and Theodore Roosevelt, using our Marines and our battleship fleet, to intervene in a variety of different Latin American countries in order to force them to pay their financial obligations to Europeans and stop them from doing things that we see as, quote, flagrant wrongdoings. This big stick diplomacy, again, becomes known as the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, and it's going to greatly expand our role in the world. Here's Theodore Roosevelt waiting around the Caribbean with our battleship fleet, enforcing laws and forcing Caribbean countries to pay their debts. This idea of the United States as sort of the arbiter between Latin America and Europe becomes sort of ingrained in American policy, with the idea that we're going to feel entitled to to intervene in Latin American countries whenever we so choose. So we have lots of awesome Theodore Roosevelt cartoons about this. And it's also the idea that the United States is going to be sort of this fair and independent broker between the old world and its growing colonies. In Latin America, this is going to happen relatively frequently because these Latin American countries are relatively unstable. We read this last semester when Latin American countries became independent, but this is Bolivar's famous Plowing the Seas speech, describing the political instability in these Latin American countries. And that's only going to be increased, or that's going to increase the desire of the United States to intervene here. And so this is sort of a self-reinforcing prophecy. The Latin American countries are unstable, so we intervene, which makes them more unstable, so we intervene. We're going to militarily occupy Cuba repeatedly, militarily occupy Nicaragua. We're going to break a blockade of Venezuela and send troops there. We're going to move troops into the Dominican Republic, and we're going to occupy Haiti repeatedly. We're also going to sponsor a rebellion in a country called Panama, but we'll talk about that momentarily. And then over time, we're also going to invade Mexico and Haiti, and we're going to occupy Puerto Rico, and we're going to occupy Cuba a whole host of different times. Basically, the United States is now going to be the major global player in Latin America, occupying Latin American countries more or less whenever we see fit. And this is going to be pretty continuous up until the 1920s. And then during the Cold War, it's also really going to step up, although that's going to be much more clandestine actions as opposed to formal U.S. troops for reasons that we'll get to when we get to the Cold War. We also now have a blue water navy, a navy that can operate pretty substantially off of our coasts. We have a global sort of empire with recoaling islands across the Pacific and in the Atlantic. And so now we also sort of want to wave the flag and show our strength. And so the, quote, Great White Fleet, our fleet of battleships, circumnavigated the globe early in Theodore Roosevelt's presidency, waving the flag and, quote, we wanted to let the world know that we were prepared for anything they wanted to kick up. We wanted to show the world what we could do. And so by having our battleships circumnavigate the globe, we prove that the United States has arrived. We can now project power anywhere away from our shores, and we're a real country that Europeans need to pay attention to. This is really also the time period where European countries start actually recognizing the United States as somewhat of an equal, sending full diplomatic delegations there, establishing embassies, and really welcoming the United States into the world. I mean, welcoming is probably too strong because I guess many Europeans would have referred to the United States as, quote, the American peril at this point because we're moving and becoming much more powerful. But it's impossible for Europeans to ignore the growing power of the United States during this time. One of the other things Theodore Roosevelt desperately wanted to do was create a canal across Latin America. Previously, there have been attempts to dig a canal across Panama here, the Isthmus of Panama, which was part of Colombia at the time. But a French company had been hired to do it, and they were progressing relatively slowly. So instead, we were digging a canal or proposing to dig a canal across Nicaragua. This was somewhat effective, but there were a couple problems. Obviously, this canal is much larger. There was also some concern about what was believed to be a species of freshwater shark in one of the lakes of Nicaragua that Theodore Roosevelt didn't want to displace. And just in general, the Panama location was seen as preferable. And so the United States, in order to get permission to dig a canal through Panama, helped sponsor some Panamanian rebels to declare their independence from Colombia. And with tacit support from the U.S. Navy and U.S. Marines, Panama became its own independent country. Here's Theodore Roosevelt advocating building a canal through Panama and why he thinks it's important. And it's pretty straightforward. And so despite how upset Colombia was over this, Theodore Roosevelt has now secured the Panama Canal and the Panama Canal Zone as a new U.S. protectorate. Here he is single-handedly digging the canal and throwing the dirt on Bogota, And in general, despite the fact that it was really unpleasant to dig this canal, tons of Americans died of yellow fever, we now have a canal from the Caribbean to the Pacific Ocean, and we get a permanent lease on the Panama Canal Zone, the area around the Panama Canal, with a railroad connecting the whole thing together, and this is now going to become part of American territory. This begins to raise the question of what's going to happen to all of these territories. The Northwest Ordinance established the process by which new territories become states, but that was only for areas that we were planning on settle and having become states. What's going to happen with already settled areas like the Philippines or just small strips of land like the Panama Canal zone? Are we going to create legislative territorial body or territorial legislatures and then have them apply for statehood? How about Guantanamo Bay? How are we going to govern that? Or Guam or American Samoa? What are we going to do with all these American protectorates? And so there's a real question here. Teddy Roosevelt, of course, here writing to the British imperialist Rudyard Kipling, noted that he thought that a lot of the people in these territories were not suited for American citizenship, and we should not put them on the same path as we would have liked the territory of Kansas. And so instead, what we decide through a series of Supreme Court cases known as the insular cases is that if we're not planning to integrate the territory in and make it a state, we do not necessarily have to provide constitutional rights for them. What we'll do instead is we're going to, quote, educate them on the principles of democracy with the idea that once they're developed enough, in sort of constitutional law, we'll eventually grant them their independence, maybe and probably. This is problematic for a whole host of reasons, but it does conveniently solve the problem of what do we do with these territories and establish that we now hold these territories where just because the U.S. flag flies, the rules of the Constitution do not necessarily hold sway. This eventually is going to be displaced by a form of economic imperialism, where instead of actually taking control of these territories, Bill Taft, we'll get to in a couple lessons, he's Theodore Roosevelt's successor, he's going to push a principle called dollar diplomacy, by which American companies are going to move into these areas, similarly to what we saw in Asia with the British East India Company taking over India. This dollar diplomacy is going to establish a series of what are called banana republics, which are mostly corrupt military governments backed by U.S. corporations in order to ensure continued U.S. investment can flow into these territories, and we're not going to have to worry about it being seized, destroyed, or anything else. So pushing stability at the cost of democratic norms and human rights in order to protect American money. So this becomes the de facto way for us to control Caribbean territories during Taft and afterwards, and there's some question as to what extent this still impacts American policy going forward. So that brings us to a close of Theodore Roosevelt's foreign policy. When we come back, we're going to look at the way that Theodore Roosevelt rewrote American domestic policy, because if there's one thing about Theodore Roosevelt, it's that he's a disruptor regardless of what he's doing. And so he's going to broadly transform the domestic political landscape of the United States for next time. Thank you for listening.